Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's wedding is suddenly looking less like a private celebration and more like a full-scale city operation. A permit obtained by the AP says this thing starts Friday afternoon, runs into the early hours of Saturday, closes off blocks in Manhattan, and could pull in up to 1,000 guests. That's a lot of sparkle, a lot of security, and a very real reminder that when famous people move a city, regular people pay the price. Good morning and welcome back to Daily. Today's biggest headline is the AP's report on Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's wedding schedule, and the reason it matters is bigger than celebrity gossip. The permit shows how much public infrastructure gets bent around elite events, and it raises familiar questions about transparency, local business disruption, and who actually gets consulted when city resources are used for private convenience. We'll also zoom out to the rest of the news cycle: the Trump administration's new smart wall on the border, fresh developments in the Iran and Gaza story, continued violence in Lebanon, a major legal and political fight over immigration protections, and a few global updates that show just how much is happening at once. If you're getting value from this, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. The wedding details came out through a city permit, not through the couple themselves, and that alone tells you something important. The permit says the main event begins Friday at 5 p.m. and may continue until 4 a.m. Saturday. It also says around 100 guests will start arriving Thursday evening for what officials described as a pre-party celebration, basically a rehearsal dinner in softer language. Then on Friday, the whole thing scales up dramatically with up to 1,000 people allowed for the main event. And this is not happening in some isolated country estate with miles of private road. It's in the heart of Manhattan, right near Madison Square Garden, and directly above Penn Station, the busiest rail hub in the United States. That means street closures, pedestrian restrictions, heavy security, and a lot of ordinary commuters having to work around a private celebration that they didn't ask for. That's the part the celebrity coverage often glides past. Yes, it's exciting for fans. Yes, Swift has a massive cultural footprint and plenty of people genuinely feel invested in her happiness. But there's another side to this story. When public streets are blocked, transit access gets restricted, and local businesses are left guessing, it stops being just a love story and starts becoming a policy story. One bar owner across from the arena basically said the quiet part out loud. If the event is lavish enough to justify permits, security, and full closures, then why should nearby businesses absorb the loss? That's a fair question. In a country that keeps talking about fairness, it's interesting how often regular shop owners are expected to eat the cost, while celebrities and institutions enjoy the upside. The AP report also says city officials have known about the wedding impact for nearly a month. Emails reportedly reference TNT wedding and even include the phrase "wedding bells are ringing" on a street closure request. So this wasn't some last-minute surprise. The city knew, staff knew, the permitting office knew, but the public mostly got silence, and that silence matters. When the government uses public space for a private event, citizens should be able to see the terms. That's not anti-celebrity, that's basic accountability. People can admire Taylor Swift and still ask why the process feels like it was built to shield everybody involved from scrutiny. At the same time, you can see why fans are treating this like a cultural milestone. Outside the arena, people were gathering, talking, celebrating, and acting like this is bigger than a wedding. For a lot of Swift fans, she's been part of their lives for years, so the emotional reaction is real. Still, emotion doesn't cancel out logistics. You've got road closures, limited pedestrian access, a highly sensitive transit bottleneck, and a city government that appears perfectly happy to let the public absorb the inconvenience while saying very little. That's exactly the kind of arrangement people complain about when the rules feel different for the connected and the famous. And if you want the most telling detail of all, it's this. The permit was for a special event at MSG, which is a very bureaucratic label for what is clearly one of the most watched celebrity weddings of the year. The city may call it paperwork. Everybody else knows it's a spectacle. The bigger takeaway here is simple. New York is being asked to make room for a billionaire-scale event, and the public is being asked to trust that everything is fine, even if the details stay hidden. That arrangement may work for the people at the top. It's a lot less comfortable for everyone else. And that question of who gets to decide, who pays, and who gets left out is not unique to Manhattan. It shows up again in another big story today: the border. The Trump administration is pushing ahead with a $46 billion border project it calls a smart wall, and that phrase is doing a lot of work. This is not just fencing. It's 30-foot steel barriers combined with sensors, cameras, towers, and surveillance systems meant to track movement across the borderlands. In other words, it's a wall and a digital monitoring network wrapped together into one giant federal investment. Supporters say the technology helps Border Patrol do its job more efficiently. Critics say it amounts to a major expansion of surveillance in communities that already live under intense government scrutiny. And both of those views matter, but the cost question matters too. Border crossings are at their lowest levels in decades. That means the administration is spending billions on a project that, at least on paper, is being justified in a moment when the immediate pressure is not what it was during earlier surges. So the obvious question is whether this is the smartest use of taxpayer money or just the most politically convenient one. A lot of people hear border security and assume that means more safety with no downside. But the border isn't some abstract line on a map. It's communities, property, commerce, daily travel, and local economies. A wall with cameras and towers doesn't just affect smugglers or migrants. It also affects ranchers, landowners, truckers, and families living right there. That's why the phrase "smart wall" should make people pause. Governments love technology because it sounds cleaner than old-fashioned enforcement. But surveillance isn't free, and it doesn't stay limited forever. Once a system like that is in place, it tends to expand, normalize, and justify itself. There's also a philosophical point here. A country can absolutely control its border, in fact it should, but the way you do that matters. A system that respects law, property rights, and limited government is different from one that turns the borderlands into an endless censor grid. Those are not the same thing, even if officials try to sell them that way. And the timing is telling. At the same time Washington is spending big on the border, it's also dealing with competing demands in foreign aid, immigration, and national security. That tension between domestic priorities and federal overreach is showing up everywhere right now. It's also worth noting that Congress already wrote a massive check for this project. So the real debate isn't whether the money exists. The real debate is whether this is the best use of it and whether voters were sold a bill of goods by the language of smart rather than by clear results. That question of government spending, priorities, and control doesn't stop at the border. It's part of the same broader pattern we're seeing in foreign policy. Big promises, little transparency, and ordinary people left to live with the consequences. Which brings us to the Middle East, where the headlines keep stacking up and the gap between official statements and real-world outcomes keeps getting harder to ignore. There's a lot moving at once here, so let's separate the noise from the substance. First, on Iran. Technical talks between the US and Iran are set to resume next week, according to reports from Pakistan, while Iran says it will not allow nuclear inspections until a final deal is reached. That's a hard line, and it shows the negotiations are still very fragile. On top of that, there's the entire Strait of Hormuz fight, where Washington and Gulf states are rejecting any idea of tolls or fees on the waterway, while Iran is floating its own post-war management framework. That framework is being sold by Iranian officials as regional cooperation, but the reality is more complicated. If a government tied to sanctions, shadow fleets, and opaque oil networks starts talking about services and fees, people are going to wonder whether this is diplomacy or a revenue scheme with better branding. And that skepticism is not random. Reporting on Iranian oil shipping has repeatedly pointed to networks tied to sanctioned elites, front companies, and ship-to-ship transfers that make it easier to hide where the oil came from and where the money goes. That doesn't mean every Iranian claim is fake, but it does mean the public should be cautious when power players talk about security in a way that just happens to open up new cash flows. The larger context matters too. Oil prices have fallen back more pre-war levels because shipping has recovered somewhat, which tells you markets are still trying to believe that the worst-case scenario can be avoided. But one incident in the wrong place can reverse that very fast. Meanwhile, in Lebanon, the violence is still grinding on despite all the diplomatic talk. Lebanon's health ministry says more people are dying from wounds tied to previous Israeli attacks. Israeli drone strikes, house burnings, and continued military activity are all being reported even as the word ceasefire keeps getting used in official language. That's the problem with these ceasefire arrangements. The label sounds reassuring, but the facts on the ground don't always match the press release. If people are still being killed, displaced, and denied safe return, then the ceasefire exists more on paper than in practice. In Gaza, the numbers are even more staggering. The reported death toll has climbed again, and the humanitarian situation remains horrific. One of the most disturbing details in this batch of reporting is the claim that Israeli forces flooded streets in one area of al-Maghazi camp with a cement-like substance, leaving roads hardened and trapping residents in their homes. That's the kind of detail that sounds almost surreal, until you remember people are trying to navigate daily life in a war zone. And once again, the language used by governments and major outlets often feels detached from the reality residents are describing. A road buried in hardened concrete is not some abstract military maneuver. It's a civilian obstruction. It means school runs, medical transport, and escape routes become harder or impossible. In the West Bank, the pattern continues with raids, killings, and land seizures. Israeli authorities also declared a sizable tract near Ramallah to be state land, which further consolidates settlement control. Whether people frame that as security or expansion depends on their politics, but the material effect is hard to miss. More land is being absorbed, more pressure is being placed on Palestinians, and the ground keeps shifting in one direction. That doesn't mean criticism of Israel is anti-anything by default. It means basic consistency. If you care about law, sovereignty, and civilian safety, you have to apply those standards evenly. Otherwise, it turns into selective outrage. And speaking of selective standards, there's a legal fight in the United States today that shows how much power can still be concentrated in Washington with almost no public input. The Supreme Court has allowed the Trump administration to strip temporary protected status from Haitians and Syrians, and that decision will affect a huge number of people who are relying on legal protection to stay in the country. Now, you can have a real argument about temporary protected status, how long it should last, and whether it's become a patch for a broken immigration system. That's fair. But whenever the federal government uses mass legal categories to make life decisions for entire populations, the human cost can be enormous. Families, jobs, housing, schools, and local communities all get pulled into the aftermath of a ruling that most Americans barely notice until it's too late. And while Washington keeps arguing over legal status and border control, Venezuela is dealing with a devastating earthquake aftermath, with the death toll still rising and thousands missing. That story hasn't gotten the same level of attention as celebrity weddings or Washington press drama, but it should. Natural disasters expose how fragile everything becomes when infrastructure is weak and institutions are already under pressure. There's also a broader pattern here. Whether it's the border wall, the immigration ruling, or foreign policy spending, the same question keeps coming back. Who benefits, who loses, and who gets the bill? Too often, the answer is that the public pays while the political class collects the applause. That's why today's news cycle feels so revealing. One part is pure spectacle. Another part is a reminder that government power once expanded rarely shrinks without a fight. And underneath all of it, regular people are the ones adjusting their lives. Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce's wedding is a major private event, but the permit shows it will have very public consequences in Manhattan, including street closures, transit restrictions, and business disruption. The Trump administration's border smart wall is not just a fence, it's a large-scale surveillance project, and the cost-benefit case for it is still very much up for debate. In the Middle East, the Iran talks, Hormuz disputes, and ongoing fighting in Gaza and Lebanon show that the region remains unstable, despite official language that often sounds more optimistic than reality. The Supreme Court's immigration ruling and Venezuela's disaster both underline a bigger truth. Federal and international decisions have real human consequences, even when they're discussed in sterile legal or diplomatic terms. That's the latest for today. If this breakdown helped connect the dots, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which story you think matters most right now. The Swift-Kelce rating shutdown, the border wall, or the deeper geopolitical stories underneath the headlines. I'll see you in the next one.